Taiwan's definition of itself is that it is the Republic of China and that it doesn't recognize the government of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party. So the claim, if you like, that China needs to occupy is not valid.
Welcome to Outpost. I'm James Glancy, and again we are live with Tom Tugendhat, but not in the studio. He is actually in Taiwan, so I thought it was a great opportunity to get an insight from the ground. Tom, how's it going out there?
Well, it's pretty interesting, actually. I've been out here for a couple of days, and one of the things that's really striking is the way in which people talk about China has changed. It's not so much the direct military threat, but much more about resilience and different forms of intimidation, which I know we're going to come on to. But I have to say, just because it's today and the announcements just happened, I have to say the response to the mega embassy in London is pretty extraordinary. People are utterly baffled as to what we think we're doing. They know what Chinese intimidation looks like. They know what the sort of, the grey zone espionage and harassment looks like. And they're frankly pretty astonished that we're allowing this to happen. I have to say I agree with them.
I know. Well, it's the same day that Trump come out against the Chagos surrender deal, and it's very clear that the ICJ ruling would have been steered in part by Chinese diplomats, Russian diplomats, or them using the system to ensure that they get a favorable outcome. That type of manipulation. I don't want to go too much onto the Chinese tentacles around the world and their belt and road. I want to really concentrate on Taiwan because you're there, and very few of us have actually been there. Can you just give us what is it like? What is the experience when you get off the plane and the vibe in society at the moment, given that in the last few months there's been some serious naval blockades and exercises by the PLA?
Well, first of all, the vibe's pretty relaxed, actually. It feels a little bit like a tropical island. That may be overstating it, but it's a Chinese city, obviously, in cultural terms, and it's it's a modern, developed town, with all the sort of traffic lights and smooth roads that you wish we had at home, maybe without the traffic lights. And it's a very nice place to be, because many of the people here, refugees from Chinese communism, there's people here from all over mainland China, which means that the food is exceptional. I mean, really, absolutely first class. And you eat far too much. It's a very, very hardworking, industrious place. It's one of those places that is really at the cutting edge of our technology as well, because the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, known as TSMC, in partnership with a Dutch company, are really the semiconductor geniuses, if you like, of the modern world. So it's all of that. It is, however, very consciously at threat from the Chinese Communist Party. So, every year they lock up a few people for spying. I'm told it was 64 in recent years. So, they're under constant threat, constant pressure. And then there's all the air incursions, Chinese aircraft buzzing or attempting to violate Taiwanese airspace. The Taiwanese respond, and most recently, you'll have heard there were various different drills by the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, surrounding or trying to surround Taiwan, and the Taiwanese Coast Guard pushing back while trying to avoid any confrontation. So in those terms, it's pretty tense, and the Taiwanese are very aware that Chinese threats could change the way of life and change their freedom completely.
But do you get any sense of militarization and preparedness in the same way as, a country that's bracing itself for potential invasion, where you might have checkpoints, or what the airports are like, or installations?
No, as far as you'd see, it's a perfectly relaxed, normal country. They do have national service. There are training events all the time, and they've given out these booklets which have the sort of various bits of preparedness. Look, they're not. It's not a militarized state in that sense, but people are aware, and people are doing national service in various different ways, and there are various events. And one of the things that they produced is I don't know if you can see it there, in case of crisis, which is it's basically a book, and it's got the usual sort of resilience things in there, where, make sure you've got enough food and water and batteries and switch on the radio and all that sort of thing. But unusually, it's got a chapter that says crisis response, military aggression. And it says seeking refuge during an air raid, spotting enemy activity, getting accurate information. And it says at the bottom, and I'll read this out directly because it tells you what kind of preparation they're getting ready for. I quote, "In the event of a military invasion of Taiwan, any claim that the government has surrendered or that the nation has been defeated is false." They're getting ready for the CCP to put out propaganda saying that there's no point in resisting, the war's over. And they're making sure that people know that the government will not surrender. And their plan, bluntly, is to resist and to make any attempted invasion as expensive and difficult as possible. Now, you and I have seen combat in various different places. And one of the places that I know we've both served is in the mountains of Afghanistan. And that wasn't surrounded by sea. The mountains here are pretty steep, and it would be a very difficult place to attack.
Absolutely, mountain warfare is challenging, but probably the most challenging is urban combat. And that leads me to the question about preparedness and strategy. So there's been a number of criticisms about the Taiwanese senior leadership pursuing capital platforms and very expensive equipment, what we regard as sort of shiny Gucci kit, like the F-35. I wouldn't say HIMARS is one, but big boats, big missiles, anything that is super expensive, highly technological. They see those as an important military asset for their protection. But a number of podcasts I've watched, one in particular with Eric Prince, it fights back against that, saying really they should be looking more at the porcupine strategy, which is the grind of urban combat. And they say that, ultimately you can only buy certain number of submarines, boats, F-35s, F-16s, and those are very traceable for the PLA. They'll know where they are, and they'll dismantle those either by long-range missiles, sabotage, or electronic warfare. I.e., if you put all your eggs into the high technological, high cost assets, and those are disabled, you're pretty much naked. Whereas the strategy that they should be going for is arming everybody. And I know weapons aren't that easily available to the population, giving military training, conscription to everybody. So in the event of an attack, every house, every feature of terrain becomes an obstacle which they have to fight through. So the cost is so great that it isn't worth it. Have you picked up any of those debates over strategy, over investing into premium, expensive military hardware versus the porcupine strategy?
Yeah, I have. And it's really interesting, actually, because the first time I came to Taiwan was about a year ago. And there was much more emphasis on what you call Gucci kit, exquisite weaponry, the sort of the expensive stuff that looks good but may not always be the most useful. This time, there's been a lot more talk about the porcupine strategy, not in those words, but in the sense that you're right, this is a very unarmed society like the United Kingdom. People don't have guns in their homes very much. But there's much more talk about weapons training so that people can be then, they can go to an arms depot if needed, and weapons can be issued very quickly to people who know how to use them. There's a lot more talk about the kind of drones that we're seeing operating in Ukraine. And, we've just seen the Ukrainian army sink the Russian Navy effectively in the Black Sea. Now, the sea states here are very different from the Black Sea. I mean, that's a bathtub compared to the waters around here. But it's still noticeable that the conversation is about the kind of drones that are now being much more widely available, made more widely available across Europe and as you know, with companies in the United States as well.
But it's Ukraine's the lesson, because, as I say,
That's right.
really it's the cottage industry of people making FPV drones, and it's the mobilization for the people. So I'm surprised they're not doing that already. Why is that?
Well, you're looking at it slightly. Forgive me. Let me be clearer. You're looking at Ukraine as FPV drones as a cottage industry, which you're completely correct about. But Ukraine has to beg, borrow, and steal sort of, guidance systems and engines and, all those sort of things. And so it's cannibalizing, everything from computer games to washing machines in order to get the various different bits of kit. The difference here is these guys are making some of the most advanced semiconductors in the world. They have no need to cannibalize it at all. They're making their own. And what they're doing is they're looking at what's going on in other countries, and they are developing and improving. I mean, it is a very, very technologically advanced society with huge and very impressive capabilities that is determined not to be invaded. Now, they don't want to change their status. There's no talk about sort of anything other than the current status that they have, but they want to make it very clear that they're not, they're no pushover.
And I should ask you at the beginning, you're obviously a member of parliament. Are you there as a member of parliament? Is this a private visit? What's your trip entailing?
It's a private visit. It came over because we're seeing in Europe and particularly in the United Kingdom huge amounts of disinformation, and this is something I started working on when I was security minister, because disinformation is how you tear a society apart. And actually, our greatest vulnerability as Brits isn't the likelihood of a military invasion. Let's be frank. I mean, there's certainly harassment that we could see in our seaways and tearing up cables and things like that. But the chance of a military invasion on the UK is very slim. What's much more likely is that people poison our minds in various different ways by spreading disinformation. And unsurprisingly, the Taiwanese face the most extraordinary amount of disinformation by the Chinese state. The CCP is very, very active in all number of different ways, from putting out fake news to sort of exaggerating stories to just frankly straight out lying. And learning from the Taiwanese actually is about protecting the UK. So that's why I'm here. What's really striking is they have set out some pretty good principles on how various different companies have to be responsible for shared liability, effectively, for anything that ends up costing individuals in terms of fraud and things like that, which means that you have much lower rates of online fraud here than you do in many other countries. Again, something we need to be learning from. And worth noting, TikTok isn't operating here. Why not? Because they refuse to be frank as to who their editors are, their publishers, effectively. And as we know, that's ByteDance, which is based in China. So TikTok is effectively edited by the Chinese Communist Party through algorithms, not directly. And yet we allow it to operate freely in the UK.
When we were last speaking about Venezuela and the Maduro operation, and whether that will be used as a justification by Putin, by Xi, for attacking Taiwan, we agreed. I don't think that model or that operation really does amount to a justification anyway. However, the Greenland debate, which we thought was a joke a year ago, is becoming very, very serious. When Trump talks about wanting to essentially annex Greenland for national security purposes, that argument, to me, is very transferable to China. And they can argue, well, this is part of our territory. This is a Chinese island. America is now posing a serious risk by the 11 billion arms deal, which they signed last month. The same justification can easily be made really now, much more credibly by Xi, given the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington.
Well, the difference is well, I mean, there's several differences. The first difference is Taiwan doesn't argue that it's an independent state. Taiwan's definition of itself is that it is the Republic of China, and that it doesn't recognize the government of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party. So the claim, if you like, that China needs to occupy is not valid. Nobody argues that Taiwan is a separate state. The Taiwanese don't, the Chinese don't. The question is who governs it. And that, we argue, or we recognize that the government of Taiwan is chosen by the Taiwanese people, and they have the right to choose their own government. The Chinese Communist Party see it as a renegade province. Now, they've had, and they still do in some ways, have relations with it, and they treat it in some ways like they do Hong Kong, one country, two systems, although, of course, in Hong Kong, that's really no longer true. And so it's not comparable in that sense that there's nothing to occupy.
No, but I'm really getting to the point here is she said he wants to reunite Taiwan with mainland China by 2028. It's very clear with that they are making military preparations. They are building barges. They are building amphibious platforms, and they're not for use anywhere else in the world apart from Taiwan. So it's very clear there's a military ramp up. I'm talking about the political justification for invading Taiwan, because it will be an invasion of some sort. They'll physically have to go there, put boots on the ground. I'm just asking you, from your experience in politics, as your experience as security minister, if this come up at all from Taiwanese people we've spoken to about Greenland, or whether it is unhelpful what
No,
Trump's doing.
Greenland hasn't come up here. I don't think that's what concerns them, if you see what I mean. What Greenland's come up as with other people is calling to question NATO. And I think that's a very major concern, and something that, you and I have focused on a lot of our working lives. And so how do we cooperate with NATO allies? And so undermining NATO in any way is extremely worrying, not just for us as NATO partners, but actually for countries like Taiwan, who fear that their allies could be distracted in other ways. So I think that's the concern. It's not so much that Greenland sets an example, or indeed that Venezuela does. The difference between the US air defenses that are stationed here, or US-made air defenses, I should say, that are stationed here, and the capability of the Taiwanese forces is night and day from Venezuela.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask if you could find out more about is the recent, I suppose you could call it, exercise of fishing vessels, which looks like a military exercise. The reason I'm curious about this is about 3 years ago, I was invited as a filmmaker to join an investigator from the New York Times, and he was investigating the Chinese dark fishing fleet. Now, this is China has over 500,000 fishing vessels, and they operate to feed China. So they go around the world and they hoover up all the marine life in a certain area. So the dark fleet's notorious for fishing off the coast of the Galapagos and many other marine protected areas where they know that there's an abundance of fish. And what they do there is they spec thousands of vessels grouped together, and at night time they turn off the AIS, often go into marine protected area, fish heavily, and then they bring it back on. The fish that they get, they transship it onto another ship, and that goes back to China. So in a very aggressive form of fishing, and it devastates marine ecosystems. But these vessels often have two purposes, are almost like a gray zone military force. A lot of them have security forces, they have their own security set up for the fleet, but they've been known to have surveillance systems on board to spy on other states. And it looks like that they are militarized. They're sort of this gray zone force, not too dissimilar as the little green men that Putin put into Crimea. It looks like they are well coordinated. Now, I'm just going to read here. On Christmas Day in 2025, so not even a month ago, 2,000 Chinese fishing vessels abruptly halted routine fishing activity, and then they suddenly formed two long parallel formations in the East China Sea. Each formation extended for roughly 460 kilometers and took the shape of an inverted L. A similar formation was again observed on January with about 1,400 Chinese vessels gathered in a rectangular formation stretching 320 kilometers. The density of the formation was so high that approaching cargo ships were forced to divert around it. So, I mean, this is extraordinary. Could you imagine trying to coordinate British fishing vessels to do anything like this? That sort of complex operation at sea means that there's coordination, and it's been orchestrated by either the military or the Chinese government for a purpose. What do you read into this? And do you think you can find out more about this?
Well, funnily enough, I was talking about it with people in the Taiwanese government today. And one of the things that's really striking about it is, of course, this is a barrier, right? But it's a mobile barrier at sea in all weathers, in all states. It's a remarkable thing to do. In fact, I haven't heard of it being done by any other fleets, maritime, fishing or otherwise. Civilian fleets don't tend to do this that I've heard of. And what this is it looks like it's another way of seeking to do a blockade should the Chinese state decide that it wishes to cut off Taiwan in order to in order to pressure it into surrender. And that's why the book that I was showing you about resilience is the main focus of the Taiwanese government, because actually what they're talking about isn't the threat of an invasion in the traditional sense, or rather that's not their prime concern is that they will be harassed to the point of attempted to try and persuade them to surrender. And I think that's what these efforts are trying to do. They're trying to demonstrate to the Taiwanese that the Chinese are dominant and there's nothing you can do.
But I mean, you look at the Chinese development of their military development, but you look at their use of here. This is grey zone activity, their fishing fleets, but they've got this very advanced hybrid development of equipment. So I have seen them converting what would be shipping container ships, oil vessels, or any sort of transport vessel, and then inserting into it modular weapon systems, so drone launchers, ballistic missile launchers. So very much like in the Second World War, where we were forced to convert merchant shipping for military purposes, China's already doing this on a much more modern scale, preparing for something either defensively or offensively. Is this something Taiwan's adopting? Just really going back to this idea of not just investing in the much more Gucci expensive kit, but really using anything to enable yourself to defend your territory.
So that didn't come up specifically, but I can tell you they are being extremely creative in their thinking, and they're talking very widely to people who make ships and who defend themselves in different ways. And it was really interesting to talk about not just Taiwan, but what they call the first island chain of states. And that's not just Taiwan, it's Japan, it's the Philippines, and all these countries together are now working together much more closely to discuss the kind of threats they're facing, learn off each other, but also to demonstrate the kind of resilience that they will need. So that kind of adaptability is definitely something people are talking about.
So what does this mean for your own? You traveling to Taiwan? You're obviously you're on a list or a watch list, or what's your official?
I'm sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party, but as their jurisdiction doesn't apply here, I've got to be honest. The Taiwanese government were rather more pleased by that than disappointed. In fact, many of them are sanctioned by China as well. So, unsurprisingly, and it means that I'm not changing planes in Hong Kong or Beijing, but other than that, it doesn't particularly affect me.
Do you think you'd be arrested if you went via China?
I don't know. I mean, the thing is, it's like so many things in dictatorships. It doesn't actually have the rule of law. The reality is there is no sanctions law in China. If you were to be sanctioned by the UK, there's a whole series of laws that go with it that say you can't have a bank account, or you can't be a director of a company or whatever. There's no law that goes with it in China. These are just words. But of course, it's a dictatorship, so it's probably best to listen to the dictator's words, because I suspect I wouldn't get a very positive reception. I may find myself staying a bit longer than I wanted to.
Well, exactly. I imagine your devices are well bugged, and they know exactly where you are at all times. I think really what I wanted to finish on is what we should look out for this year with regards to China-Taiwan relations. I know there has been a lot more in the press with Japan, much more militaristic talk in Japan about defending Taiwan and what an invasion would mean for Japan. But are there any sort of notable dates or actions that you think might happen this year?
So I think there's a few things that I'd look out for. The first is the Chinese state, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, are now calling into question, somewhat bizarrely, Japan's sovereignty over the island of Okinawa, which, as you know, is where the US have a major naval base. They're claiming, somewhat spuriously, that given that the Chinese were not signatories to the San Francisco Treaty in 1951, I believe it was, they don't recognize that post-war Japanese hold of Okinawa, which is frankly extraordinary. So I think there's growing tension there. And secondly, I think there's growing tension with the Philippines that we've got to look out for, as we're seeing Chinese Coast Guard vessels, or so-called Coast Guard vessels, because they're behaving in the way of a sort of very hostile navy. But they're ramming Philippine ships at sea. And so we're seeing quite a change in the stance Now, I think those are the main things to look out for, because what we're seeing in Taiwan is likely just to ramp up. Now, I know the Taiwanese are trying to maintain their own defense and the status quo, but at the same time, not give any ground. And they're concerned that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to push them into.
One thing I'm not getting into predictions here, but one area of interest to me has been the Chinese desire potentially to retake Vladivostok in Russia. And there's a lot of talk about how much Chinese influence has gone over the border into Russia. So whilst Putin and Russia has been really had all their efforts focused on Ukraine, they've really forgotten their eastern flank, assuming China is a good friend of theirs. But of course, Vladivostok and some of these parts of Russia were lost to China, and what I think is called the century of humiliation. It was part of the Qing dynasty in the 1800s. So these are historically and culturally Chinese lands, and I just wonder, we seem to be this imperial age of people wanting to annex territory, retake their spheres of influence. I just wonder whether this is really going to come into play over the next decade of China trying to reconquer old territories that were historically part of China.
Well, I'm not going to predict what the CCP are going to do, but I will give you a fact, and that's that a number of years ago, if you looked at a map of Russia and you saw the Chinese version, it said, where it says Vladivostok, it said that the Chinese transliteration effectively of Vladivostok. Today, if you look at that same map, it doesn't say that. It uses the old Chinese name of Sea Cucumber Bay. Now, that's quite telling, that they're using the old Chinese imperial name for a city or a town that has been occupied or under Russian control, to be neutral about it for well over 150 years. So it's a statement, isn't it? Now, whether they're going to do anything about it, God only knows. But the reality is they are demonstrating that they haven't forgotten, and that alone, I think, is quite telling.
Or maybe we should do the same and look at Calais. On which day, well, look, it's good to see you. When you're back, let's get back in the studio. I mean, we keep taking every week. Well, this has been a fast start to the world events in January, and it's not stopped at all. If anything, it's speeding up.
Well, I think we should sit down at the end of January and just run through a few of the items, because frankly, there's been a hell of a lot of change. And I think this is a year which is going to be pretty decisive in various ways. The decisions that President Trump has taken even today have been pretty extraordinary. And the way in which we're seeing our allies and our partners having to respond means that we really do need to think about our future.
Yep, absolutely. Right. Well, we will be back on Outpost soon. And thank you for everyone that's joined us on this conversation. If you have any questions, put it onto our Substack, James Glancy, Tom Tugendhat, and please follow Tom's dispatches. Please subscribe to us at Outpost. We've got some really exciting shows launching in the next few weeks and months. So just keep checking in and subscribe, and you'll get details of what new shows we've got coming out very soon. Thank you.